Their marriage had started like a fairy tale. Late-night talks, laughter that echoed through their apartment, and passionate weekends spent exploring their favorite cities. But now, their once vibrant connection felt strained, brittle, like a once beautiful painting that had faded with time. Sophie ran her hands through her hair, trying to focus. She had never imagined that her life would take such a painful turn. How had she arrived here? How had she allowed herself to fall into this? Her mind drifted back to the beginning of everything, the first time she had met Julian. It was just a casual meeting at work, one of those fleeting moments that didn't seem significant at the time. Julian was charming, confident, and most importantly, he seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. The conversations were easy, the chemistry undeniable. Julian had become her escape. He made her feel seen, in a way she hadn't felt in months. His attention was a balm to the wound of growing distance between her and Max. What had started as an innocent friendship had slowly transformed into something much darker, something she couldn't control. At first, Sophie had tried to ignore it. She told herself that this was nothing more than a passing attraction, a temporary distraction. But as the weeks passed, the lines blurred. The stolen moments, the whispered conversations, and the stolen glances had turned into more. And soon, Sophie was betraying her husband in ways she never thought she would. She remembered the night it all changed. It had been a quiet evening at home, just like any other. Max had been working late, as he often did. Sophie had planned to wait up for him, but Julian's text had come at the wrong time. One thing had led to another, and before she knew it, she was in Julian's arms, her guilt drowned out by the overwhelming feelings that surged through her. She hadn't planned for it to happen, but it did. And now, Sophie was paying the price. It had been 2 weeks since that night. Sophie's guilt had grown to an unbearable level. Every time Max kissed her, every time he looked at her with love in his eyes, she felt like a fraud. Her heart ached for the man who had stood by her through everything, and yet, she had betrayed him in the worst way possible. Max had been different lately, too. He'd grown quieter, more withdrawn, and Sophie couldn't help but wonder if he knew. If he suspected. Maybe that was why he seemed to retreat into himself more. Maybe he was hiding the hurt, just as she was. But Sophie couldn't bear the thought of him finding out. It wasn't just the shame of cheating, it was the fact that she was still in love with him. She loved Max. She just didn't know how to love him the way he deserved. That evening, Max came home earlier than expected, his briefcase in hand, his face tired but smiling. Sophie quickly wiped away a stray tear that had escaped her eye and forced a smile. "Hey," Max greeted, setting his bag down. "You okay?" Sophie nodded, but the lie sat heavy in her chest. "Yeah, just tired." He walked over and kissed her forehead, the way he always did. She closed her eyes for a brief second, savoring the warmth of his touch. But even that felt wrong. "I missed you today," he said softly, his voice filled with affection. "I missed you too," Sophie whispered back, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. She wanted to say so much more, to confess everything, but she couldn't bring herself to. How could she destroy everything she had worked so hard for? How could she hurt him when he had always been there for her? Max leaned back, watching her intently. He seemed to be studying her, as if trying to read her thoughts. Sophie looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She felt his eyes on her, searching, waiting. She wasn't sure if he knew, or if he was just sensing the distance between them. Either way, the tension in the room was palpable. "Sophie," he said after a pause, his voice low. "Is there something you need to tell me?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. Her throat went dry, and her breath caught in her lungs. For a moment, she considered telling him everything. The truth, the affair, the guilt she carried every day. But she couldn't. She wasn't sure if she even knew how to fix it anymore. She had already crossed a line, and now the consequences seemed too great to bear. "I'm just tired, Max," she repeated, her voice cracking. "Really? Nothing's wrong." Max's expression softened, but there was still something in his eyes that made Sophie uneasy. He nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of something darker in his gaze, something Sophie couldn't quite place. "Well, if you ever want to talk, you know I'm here, right?" he said gently. Sophie nodded, unable to speak, her heart breaking with every passing second. That night, after Max had gone to bed, Sophie lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She felt like she was suffocating, trapped in a life that was no longer her own. Every moment felt like a lie, and she didn't know how to make it stop. The love she had for Max was still there, but the distance, the shame, and the betrayal had clouded it. And Julian, he was a reminder of a passion Sophie had longed for, but didn't know how to reclaim in her marriage. But deep down, Sophie knew what she had to do. She had to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. She couldn't keep living a lie, not like this. She had to choose. Max deserved better. And Sophie owed herself the honesty she had been avoiding for too long. The next morning, when Max kissed her goodbye, Sophie looked him in the eyes and felt the weight of her decision. She wasn't sure how things would unfold, but one thing was certain. She had to make a choice. And it was time to stop running from the truth. For better or worse, Sophie had to come clean, not just to Max, but to herself. Because love, in all its complexities, couldn't thrive in a house built on lies.